Some memories feel more like warnings, whispers from a place you can't quite recall. The accounts you're about to hear live in that space, where the world you know begins to fray at the edges. You're about to hear stories that blur the line between memory and nightmare. Enter the world of true horror stories and subscribe, but only if you're really not afraid. Seriously. The Silent Siren. The night of January 12th, 2002 was what passed for peaceful in Valdez, Alaska. Fire Chief Mike Connolly remembered the cold being so profound that the air itself seemed to crackle, a dry, static silence that swallowed every sound. The waters of the fjord were a sheet of polished obsidian reflecting a handful of indifferent stars, and the town was a collection of muted lights huddled against an immense and ancient darkness. Connolly was at his desk in the fire station, a fortress of brick and procedure, reviewing fleet maintenance logs with the methodical calm that had defined his 20-year career. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the building's heater and the slow, deliberate scratch of his pen on paper. It was a rhythm he knew well, a rhythm of safety and order in a land that was fundamentally neither. That was when the siren began to wail. It wasn't a tentative start, not the groan of old machinery waking up, but a full-throated, piercing scream that ripped through the stillness of the port town. Every head in the station snapped up. For a moment, nobody moved, a tableau of disbelief. The siren was their instrument, a tool they controlled with codes and signals, reserved for tsunamis, for catastrophic industrial accidents, for the kind of emergencies that sent a primal fear through the most hardened first responder. But there had been no signal. Connolly's hand was already reaching for the radio handset when the dispatcher's voice, tight with confusion, crackled through the speaker. She confirmed what he already knew in his gut. There was no earthquake alert from the Tsunami Warning Center, no distress call from the refinery, no activation signal sent from her console. The control board was green across the board, placid and unresponsive, yet the siren on the hill overlooking the town continued its desperate, relentless cry. Protocol took over. Crews scrambled, engines roared to life, their flashing lights painting the station walls in frantic strokes of red and blue. They were responding to their own alarm, a ghost call from a machine they trusted with their lives. As they pulled out onto the empty streets, the sound was overwhelming, of physical pressure against their ears. And that's when the first call came in from a resident near the harbor. The caller, a seasoned fisherman, sounded shaken. He said he heard the town siren, of course, but there was another one, a second sound, fainter, echoing it from out on the water. It was a perfect mirror of the main alarm, just delayed by a few seconds. A chilling vocal shadow rising from the black depths of the fjord. Connolly, riding in the command vehicle, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Harbor acoustics were tricky, he knew that. Echoes could play strange tricks. But this was different. The reports kept coming in, a dozen calls in 5 minutes, all describing the same thing. A phantom siren out in the empty harbor. A crew was dispatched to the siren control station, a small, windowless blockhouse on the hill. They found the door locked, the interior silent save for the loud thrum of the relay switch, which was physically engaged. The control panel inside showed no incoming signal. It had activated itself. Technicians were summoned from their beds, their faces etched with the same bewildered urgency as everyone else. Their initial diagnosis was logical, expected: a corroded circuit, a power surge, a simple malfunction. They worked for nearly an hour, the siren's cry never wavering. The phantom echo from the water, a constant ghostly companion. Finally, unable to isolate the fault, the lead technician made a decision. He would cut the main power. With a heavy thud of a breaker being thrown, the mechanical wail from the hill abruptly died. A collective sigh of relief went through the assembled crews as blessed silence returned to the town. But it was a fleeting peace, because the echo from the harbor did not stop. For 2 full minutes after the primary siren fell silent, the faint, ethereal copy of its wail continued to rise from the dark water. It was a sound with no source, a cry with no voice, an impossibly sustained echo of a sound that no longer existed. It rose and fell in perfect cadence, a disembodied lament, before slowly, gradually fading away into the crushing, absolute silence of the Alaskan night. In the final report, the event was logged as a multi-system electrical failure compounded by anomalous atmospheric conditions creating a persistent acoustic reflection. It was a rational explanation for an irrational event, but Mike Connolly, and every firefighter and resident who stood in the cold that night, knew that what they heard wasn't a reflection. It was a response. It was the sound of something ancient, deep in the cold, dark water, answering a call that was never made. The fire department's alarm log for that date simply reads 0117, city siren activation, cause unknown. But there is an unofficial, unspoken addendum to that log, a memory of a sound that belonged to the fjord itself, a silent siren that still echoes in the darkest hours of the Valdez night, a warning for a disaster that never arrived, or perhaps one that never left. The mine elevator, David Pace, was a man who believed in the tangible world, in the precise language of stress tolerances, metal fatigue, and geological surveys. As a safety inspector for the Mine Safety and Health Administration, his job was to translate the chaotic underground world into the orderly columns of a report. In August of 1991, he was assigned the final decommission inspection of a shuttered Kennecott copper mine, a sprawling network of tunnels and shafts that had been silent for decades. The air inside had a taste, a metallic, dead-air flavor of deep earth and forgotten labor. Dust motes, ancient and undisturbed, danced in the beam of his headlamp, the only light in a place that had been starved of it for a generation. His task was straightforward: to verify that all equipment was inoperable, all shafts secured, before the entrance was permanently sealed with concrete. The mine was a tomb, and he was there to write its epitaph. He started with the main hoisting works, a cavernous chamber housing the machinery for the primary freight elevator, a massive steel cage designated simply as Cage 4. The power had been cut at the substation miles away, but his checklist required a final test. He connected a portable generator, its loud, modern roar an obscene intrusion into the profound silence. He threw the main breaker, and the old control panels flickered to life with a reluctant, dusty glow. According to the schematics, Cage 4 should have been resting at the bottom of the main shaft, 2,000 feet below. As a final check, he toggled the recall switch. Nothing happened. The cables remained slack, the enormous winch drum motionless. Satisfied, he noted it in his log. Hoist motor inoperable. He was about to disconnect the generator when he heard it, a low groaning sound, the sound of immense weight shifting. He looked up at the winch drum. It was turning. Slowly, with a sound like grinding teeth, the thick steel cable was being reeled in, coiling itself with perfect, mesmerizing precision. The weight indicator needle, which should have been dead, crept upward, indicating a load ascending from the deep blackness of the shaft. David froze, his mind racing through every possible explanation. A power surge from the generator? A mechanical failure causing the drum brake to release? None of it made sense. The motor wasn't even engaged. Yet the cage was rising. He could hear it now. A distant scraping sound, growing steadily closer. A metal beast climbing out of the abyss on its own volition. He backed away from the edge of the shaft, his heart pounding a heavy, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. The ascent took nearly 15 minutes, when the top of the cage finally emerged from the collar of the shaft, clanging into place with a shudder that echoed through the chamber. David stared, his rational mind failing to process what his eyes were seeing. The elevator was not empty. It was filled, nearly to the top, with fresh gravel and rock, the kind produced by active blasting or drilling. The stones were damp, gleaming under his headlamp, some showing the sharp, clean edges of a recent break. This was impossible. The access shafts above this level had been collapsed and sealed since the 50s. Nothing had come down that shaft in over 30 years. There was no source for the rock. Trembling, he followed his training. He documented. He pulled out his standard issue camera, the one with the powerful flash, and took a photograph. The sudden, brilliant light making the wet stones glitter like a hoard of malevolent jewels. Evidence tag, MSHA, inspection report, August 1991. He knew he had to finish his inspection of the lower levels. It was his job. With a sense of surreal detachment, he used a shovel from the tool locker to painstakingly clear the gravel from the cage, dumping it into a nearby ore cart. The stones were cold, unnaturally so, chilling his hands through his thick work gloves. The task took an hour spent in the company of a silent, impossible miracle of geology. Finally, the cage was empty. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside, pulled the gate shut, and engaged the descent lever. The cage dropped into the earth with a lurch, his generator's hum fading above him. The inspection of the lower tunnels was a blur of suffocating silence and creeping dread. Every shadow seemed to move. Every drip of water sounded like a footstep. He did his work, ticking off boxes on his clipboard, a man on autopilot. He found nothing out of the ordinary, just decades of decay. When he was done, he returned to the shaft and signaled for the cage. He waited, the darkness pressing in, for the telltale groan of its descent. It arrived empty, just as he had left it. But as the beam of his headlamp played across the steel floor of the cage, he noticed something. It was clean. The dust and residue from the gravel he had shoveled out were gone. He ran his glove over the floor. It came away spotless. He then looked at the tracks, the guide rails running the length of the shaft. They were gleaming, wiped clean of the decades of grease and grime. They looked as if they had just been polished. He looked back at his camera, hanging from his neck. The photograph was the only proof that the gravel had ever been there. His final report was concise, factual, and included the photograph of the inexplicable load. He detailed the autonomous ascent, the impossible cargo, the cleaned rails. He expected a call from his supervisor, questions, perhaps even a psychological evaluation. He received none of that. What he received 2 days later was a single, terse directive via a secured telex. Inspection terminated. Site to be permanently sealed by U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. You are directed to surrender all notes and film. Do not discuss your findings. There was no explanation. The official MSHA report, when it was finally published, made no mention of the gravel. It cited only unstable hoisting equipment and potential for shaft collapse as the reason for the expedited sealing. But David Pace knew. He knew that deep beneath the earth, in a darkness that would never again see the light of day, the mine was not dead. Cage 4 was still running. It was still hauling its impossible cargo from some newly opened vein, operated by miners who had never clocked out. The floating shack, the Kuskokwim River during breakup season, is a force of nature, a slow-motion catastrophe of grinding ice and churning silt-heavy water. For Elias Thorne, a fisherman who had spent 40 of his 60 years on its banks, it was a time of vigilance and respect. In May of 2010, he was poling his flat-bottomed skiff through a channel of relatively clear water, checking his nets, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and thawing vegetation. The sun was a pale disk in a vast gray sky. That's when he saw it. Adrift in the main current, moving with a slow, deliberate grace amidst the debris of fractured ice floes, was a cabin, not the wreckage of one, but a small, intact fishing shack, complete with a rusted tin roof and a small, crooked porch. It looked for all the world like someone had simply picked it up from the riverbank and set it gently in the water. Elias had seen a lot of strange things get carried away by the breakup, but never an entire building floating as placidly as a riverboat. Curiosity overriding caution, he motored closer. The cabin was old, built of weathered, silvered logs chinked with moss. It had no visible registration numbers, no identifying marks of any kind. It just was. As he circled it, he noticed a thin plume of smoke curling from its crooked stovepipe. Someone was inside, or had been, very recently. He hailed the cabin, his voice swallowed by the immense landscape. There was no reply. The structure was snagged in a tangle of uprooted spruce trees, and he knew that once the current caught it again, it would be torn to pieces. Acting on an instinct he couldn't quite name, part salvage, part rescue, he secured a heavy tow line to the cabin's porch supports. His small engine strained, but slowly, agonizingly, he managed to pull the impossible vessel out of the main channel and ground it on a muddy, willow-choked bank. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the groaning of the river ice. He tied the shack securely to a thicket of sturdy alders, the rope looking comically thin against the building's bulk. He called out again. Still nothing. The front door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he stepped into a single, small room. The air inside was warm. A fire was banked in the small, pot-bellied stove, its embers glowing a soft, welcoming red. On a rough-hewn table sat a tin plate with the remains of a meal of dried fish and hardtack. A kerosene lantern, its fuel full, was lit and burning with a steady, clean flame. The place was tidy, lived in. A bedroll was neatly stowed in a corner, and shelves on the wall held tins of food, a small collection of books, and a neatly coiled fishing net. There were no clothes, no personal photographs, no letters. It was a place of perfect, anonymous utility. It was as if its occupant had just stepped out for a moment, intending to return any second. Elias backed out, a strange feeling of trespass prickling his skin. This wasn't an abandoned shack. It was a home. He immediately motored to the nearest village and reported his find to the Alaska wildlife troopers. A field officer met him at the site the next morning. The trooper, a young, practical man named Davies, was as baffled as Elias. They searched the cabin thoroughly. They found no identification, no logbooks, no hint of who lived there. The ashes in the stove were still warm. The lantern had burned itself out. Trooper Davies ran a check on the cabin. No building permits matched its description. No landholder had reported a missing structure. He put out a bulletin across the regional radio network, describing the floating cabin and asking for the owner to come forward. Days turned into weeks. The story became a piece of local curiosity, a minor mystery in a land full of them. No family reported a missing member. No one claimed the strange, itinerant home. It sat on the riverbank, tied to the alders, a silent, stubborn fact. The authorities, having no jurisdiction over unclaimed, unregistered property that wasn't on public land, eventually declared it a non-issue. Elias kept an eye on it. He would motor past every few days, a self-appointed custodian. The cabin never changed. Its door remained shut, its single window a dark, unblinking eye. Summer came, and the river settled into its placid, wide flow. The grass grew high around the cabin's foundationless base, making it look as though it had always been there. Then winter returned, locking the river in ice, burying the landscape in a deep, sound-dampening blanket of snow. The cabin became a familiar, if unsettling, part of the scenery on Elias's trapline runs. The following spring, as the Kuskokwim once again began its violent annual ritual of breaking apart, Elias went to check on the cabin. He expected to find it damaged by the shifting ice, perhaps even pulled from its moorings. He found nothing. The thick tow rope he had used to secure it was still there, tied neatly to the alder thicket, but the other end of the rope was gone, frayed as if it had simply dissolved. And the cabin itself had vanished. There was no impression in the mud where it had rested for nearly a year. There was no trail of debris, no sign that it had been dragged or torn away. The willows and grass it had crushed were standing upright, as if they had never been disturbed. It was simply gone. The Alaska Wildlife Troopers field note from May 2010 is brief. It documents the discovery and the subsequent disappearance, officially closing the file with the logical assumption that the spring ice breakup had finally claimed the structure, pulling it from the bank and destroying it downstream. But Elias Thorne knows better. He knows that a cabin which can appear from nowhere, fully alive and warm, can just as easily depart. He never travels that stretch of the river without scanning the opposite bank, half expecting to see a thin plume of smoke rising from a crooked stovepipe. A silent invitation from a home that has no anchor, a place that belongs not to the land but only to the river. The Skagway Tunnel. For the railroad maintenance crews on the White Pass and Yukon route, Tunnel number 6 was just a dark spot on the map, a relic of a bygone era. It was a short, unlined bore, blasted through solid granite, bypassed in the late 60s for a more stable, open-air cut. The original tracks had been pulled up decades ago, and both entrances were sealed with heavy, padlocked steel doors. In October of 1986, a man named Frank Coleman, a veteran track inspector with a face like a topographical map of the Alaskan range, was walking the line on a routine check. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and impending snow. As he passed the rust-streaked entrance to the old tunnel, he stopped. He heard something. It was a rhythmic, metallic sound. A steady, deliberate clang, clang, clang. Like someone driving railroad spikes with a sledgehammer. Frank frowned. He knew every sound of the railway. The groan of the rails under a heavy load, the chatter of the diesel engines, the wind whistling through the steel trestles. This was different. It was the sound of work being done. He put his ear to the cold steel of the door. The sound was clearer now, resonating through the metal. It was deep inside the tunnel, a steady, unhurried pace of manual labor. He checked the padlock. It was a massive, state-of-the-art bolt, caked in rust but firmly locked. There was no way in. He called it in to his supervisor, who dismissed it as an echo from the new line. Maybe a rockfall inside the tunnel. Rockfalls didn't sound like a hammer striking steel. Frank knew the difference. He logged it in his report. A simple, factual entry. Audible, rhythmic tapping from within sealed Tunnel 6. A week later, he was on the same section of track with a junior engineer named Ben. As they approached the tunnel, Frank stopped and held up a hand. Silence. He gestured for Ben to listen. At first, there was nothing but the wind. Then, faint but unmistakable, it began again. Clang, clang, clang. Ben's eyes widened. "What is that?" he whispered, as if afraid of being overheard. "Sounds like a spike hammer," Frank said grimly. This time, they had equipment. Frank's supervisor, now intrigued by the second report, had authorized them to set up a sensitive audio recorder. They placed the parabolic microphone against the steel door, ran a cable to a heavy-duty tape recorder, and left it there, a silent, electronic ear pressed against the mountain's secret. They retrieved it 24 hours later. Back in the warmth of the Skagway maintenance shed, they played the tape. For hours, there was nothing but the low rumble of wind and the distant passage of trains on the main line. Then, at precisely 2:17 a.m., the sound began. It was perfectly clear on the recording. A crisp, resonant hammering that was undeniably the sound of a 9-pound spike maul hitting a steel spike. The rhythm was flawless, a steady 1.5-second interval between strikes. It continued, without pause or variation, for exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The engineers in the office were baffled. They analyzed the waveform, confirming it matched their reference recordings of track-laying work. But the acoustics suggested it was happening about 200 yards inside the tunnel. The decision was made to open it up. A crew was assembled a few days later, armed with bolt cutters and heavy-duty flashlights. The supervisor, a no-nonsense man named Henderson, was there himself, his skepticism warring with a growing sense of unease. The thick padlock was cut, its shackle groaning in protest. With a combined effort, the crew heaved the massive steel door open, revealing a wall of absolute, undisturbed blackness. The air that rolled out was cold, stagnant, and smelled of damp rock and nothing else. They stepped inside, their powerful beams cutting through the darkness. The old railbed was there, a flat, gravel-covered path running into the gloom. The rock walls were slick with moisture. They walked slowly, their footsteps echoing unnervously. 200 yards in, exactly where the audio analysis had pinpointed the sound, they found them, laid out on the gravel of the old railbed in a perfect, orderly line, was a set of antique railroad tools. A spike maul with a weathered hickory handle, a claw bar for pulling spikes, a track gauge, and a small, rusted tin of spikes. The tools were clean, free of the dust and grime that covered everything else in the tunnel. The head of the hammer gleamed faintly in their flashlight beams, as if it had been recently used. The crew stood in stunned silence. There were no footprints in the dust leading to or from the tools, other than their own. The air was utterly still. There was no sign of who had been there or how they had gotten in. Henderson ordered a complete search of the tunnel. They went from one end to the other. They found nothing. No other tools, no hidden entrances, no person, just that solitary, impossible display of labor. The service memo issued by the Alaska Railroad was a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. It noted the discovery of unaccounted for vintage equipment in a secured area and mandated the immediate resealing of the tunnel, this time with welded plates over the doors. Frank Coleman never walked that section of track again without a feeling of cold dread. He knew, as did everyone who was there that day, that the official explanation of trespassers or a prank didn't hold water. Trespassers leave tracks. Pranksters don't work to a precise schedule in the dead of night, inside a sealed mountain. He still has a copy of the audio recording. Sometimes, late at night, he plays it, listening to that steady, rhythmic hammering. It is the sound of a job being done. A spectral crew forever laying a phantom track in the cold, permanent darkness, forever building a railroad to nowhere. The ghost net buoy. In the turbulent waters of the Bering Sea near Dutch Harbor, the line between science and folklore is often blurred by fog and fatigue. For Dr. Aris Thorne, a technician with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the world was one of data, of sonar pings and telemetry streams. In July of 2005, he was tasked with the routine maintenance of a deep water data buoy, designated Station 46073. It was a lonely job, miles from shore, with only the cries of gulls and the endless gray swell for company. Station 46073 had been flagging an anomaly for weeks. Its subsurface sonar, designed to monitor currents and marine life, was consistently logging a large stationary mass suspended at a depth of 300 feet. The object's acoustic signature was unmistakable to the analysis software. A massive, tangled web of synthetic material, characteristic of a ghost net. Ghost nets, lost or discarded fishing gear, are a common and dangerous plague in these waters, drifting for years and entangling marine life. The anomaly was its size and its stillness. This wasn't a drifting net. The buoy's GPS showed it was holding its position against the powerful currents, as if anchored to the seafloor 2,000 feet below. Yet the sonar showed clear water between the bottom of the mass and the seabed. It was just hanging there, a silent, invisible curtain in the mid-water column. Aris's first task was a remote visual inspection. He deployed a small tethered ROV, a remotely operated vehicle equipped with a high-definition camera and powerful lights. He watched the monitor in the cabin of his research vessel as the ROV descended, the water shifting from gray-green to a deep, featureless indigo. The depth gauge ticked past 250 feet, then 300, then 350. He piloted the drone in a wide, sweeping circle around the buoy's anchor line. The sonar on his console painted a clear picture of the massive net, a ghostly blob just a few yards away. But the camera feed showed nothing. Absolutely nothing. There was only the empty, black water filled with the glittering dust of marine snow. He rebooted the sonar, ran a diagnostic on the ROV's camera. Everything was functioning perfectly. He could see the net on one screen, and on the other, he could see the empty space where the net was supposed to be. He spent 4 hours sweeping the area, a growing sense of dislocation creeping over him. The data insisted on a physical object, but reality refused to comply. The buoy itself was registering a physical drag, its anchor chain straining at an angle inconsistent with the current alone. It was behaving exactly as if a 1,000-pound net were snagged on its mooring. But there was nothing there. Back at the Dutch Harbor office, the data was scrutinized by a team of oceanographers. They theorized a rare thermal inversion, a so-called thermocline, could be creating a false sonar reflection, a kind of underwater mirage. It was a plausible, if unusual, explanation. The physical drag on the buoy was attributed to a snag on an uncharted rock formation. The incident was logged, and the buoy's anomalous readings were flagged for recalibration. Yet the mystery deepened. Over the next few months, fishing vessels working that same quadrant began reporting strange occurrences. A crab boat, the Northern Star, reported its pots getting snagged on something massive at a depth of 300 feet. They spent 6 hours trying to free their gear, their winches straining to the breaking point. When the line finally snapped, they pulled up hundreds of feet of cable, but the pots were gone. The captain reported it as a snag on a ghost net, a common enough occurrence. But what was uncommon was that his own vessel's advanced sonar had shown the water was completely clear. Weeks later, a longliner, the Pelagic, had a similar experience, losing nearly a mile of gear in the same area at the same depth. Again, their equipment registered a massive entanglement, but their fish finders and sonar screens showed nothing but open water. The reports became a kind of dark legend among the fishing fleet, a haunted patch of sea where gear would simply vanish into thin air, pulled away by an invisible force. Thorne could never shake the feeling of that day on the water. The stark contradiction between his instruments and his own eyes had unsettled him to his core. He continued to monitor Station 46073's data stream. The Phantom Net was still there, a persistent ghost on the sonar logs, a steady, inexplicable strain on the buoy's mooring. The official explanation held a persistent thermocline, a geological snag. But Aris had seen the captain of the Northern Star in a bar in Dutch Harbor, a man with 25 years of experience in the Bering Sea. The man's hands were shaking as he described the feeling of his boat being held fast by something that wasn't there. He said it felt like the ocean itself had grown teeth. The NOAA sonar log from July 2005 remains an official record of a curious oceanographic phenomenon. It documents the readings, the visual inspection, and the logical conclusions, but it cannot document the chilling feeling of knowing that for months a buoy bobbed on the surface, its anchor chain pulled taut by the immense weight of a net that occupied a space in physics but not in reality. It cannot explain the lost fishing gear, or the deeply unsettled feeling of the men who work those waters, who now give that particular quadrant a wide berth, unwilling to risk their equipment and perhaps their sanity in the hunting grounds of a net that is not there, a ghost that still fishes in the cold, dark, and hungry water. The darkened control tower Dead Horse, Alaska, is less a town and more a functional outpost, a place of temporary existence on the edge of the Arctic Ocean. Its airport is a critical artery, a lifeline of steel and kerosene against a landscape of overwhelming emptiness. For Liam Byers, an air traffic controller working the night shift in February of 2013, the view from the control tower was usually one of profound and absolute darkness, punctuated only by the landing lights of approaching aircraft. The tower was his world, a glass-walled room suspended in the sky, warm and bright against the brutal cold outside. The night of the incident was typical. The temperature was 40 below zero, and a thick ice fog had descended, reducing visibility to near zero and encasing every surface in a crystalline layer of rime. Liam was guiding in a cargo flight from Anchorage, his voice a calm, steady presence in the pilot's ear, a thread of human connection in the vast, disorienting whiteness. The pilot's voice crackled over the radio, professional, but with a slight edge of confusion. Dead Horse Tower, Caribou 7-4. We're on final approach, but we don't have a visual on your tower lights. Can you confirm they're active? Liam glanced up at the powerful beacon on the tower's roof. its brilliant white flash cutting a familiar path through the fog. He looked around the control room, at the brightly lit panels and computer screens. Everything was normal. Caribou 7 to 4, that's a negative? Liam replied, his own brow furrowing. All our lighting systems are operational. You should have a clear visual on us. There was a pause. Tower. We are at 500 feet and still don't see you. Your entire structure is dark. It's just a silhouette against the apron lights. This was impossible. Liam could see the apron lights below him, casting a warm, orange glow on the fog. The tower was a beacon. He and the two other controllers on shift exchanged baffled looks. They were sitting in a brightly lit room, but to the pilots just a few thousand feet away, they were in complete darkness. They guided the plane in using instruments alone, the pilot's voice growing more tense as he landed blind, trusting his screens over his own eyes. The moment the plane touched down and rolled past the tower, the pilot came back on the radio, his voice filled with relief and utter bewilderment. "Okay, tower, I see you now." You just lit up. All at once, Liam and his colleagues rushed to the windows. The plane was there on the taxiway, its engines winding down. From their perspective, nothing had changed. The lights had been on the entire time. They logged the event as a possible electrical issue and called in the facility's maintenance crew. The technicians spent an hour checking every circuit, every bulb, every backup generator. They found nothing. The tower's electrical system was, by every metric, functioning perfectly. An hour later, a second flight, a small charter, reported the exact same thing on its approach. The tower was a black void, a missing piece of the airfield, until the moment they were on the ground, at which point it reappeared, fully illuminated. This time, Liam had an idea. He called down to the ground crew supervisor on the apron and asked him to look up at the tower and describe what he saw. The supervisor's voice came back over the walkie-talkie, laced with awe. "Liam, I'm looking right at you, but the entire cab is dark. I can see the outline of it against the sky, but the windows are black. It looks like the building is abandoned." Inside the control room, the fluorescent lights hummed brightly. Liam held his hand up in the window, but the supervisor saw nothing. It was as if a curtain of impenetrable shadow had been drawn around the glass, a shadow that was only visible from the outside. They took out a video camera, and a ground crew member filmed the tower from the tarmac. The footage was chilling. It showed the tower as a stark, dark shape. The brilliant strobe on its roof was invisible. The brightly lit interior was a patch of absolute black. On the audio, you could hear Liam's voice, transmitted by radio, calmly guiding in the next flight from a building that, on screen, appeared to be completely devoid of power and life. The anomaly repeated itself for the next 2 nights, always between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. Pilots grew accustomed to the unnerving phenomenon, being talked down by a disembodied voice from a ghost tower. The FAA facility report logged the incidents, and the official explanation settled on a complex atmospheric condition, a rare form of light refraction caused by the specific temperature and the crystalline structure of the ice fog. The theory was that the fog was bending the light from the tower away from observers, creating a sort of natural cloaking device. It was a scientifically plausible theory, a neat and tidy box for a deeply unsettling experience. But the controllers who were there, sitting in their warm, bright room while pilots described their disconcerting blackness, don't fully accept it. Liam Byers, in his statement, described a feeling that grew with each incident, a feeling of being watched, not from the outside, but from the darkness itself. He felt as though the tower wasn't being hidden by the fog, but that something in the fog was actively erasing it. The video footage remains in the FAA archives, a piece of objective evidence showing something that shouldn't be possible. It's a silent testament to 3 nights in the Arctic winter when the Dead Horse Control Tower, a beacon of safety and technology, was simply swallowed by the dark, leaving only its voice to prove it was still there. The Kenai sounder Harold Vance was a man who lived in a world of invisible voices, an amateur radio hobbyist operating out of his small, cluttered home in Soldotna. He spent his nights with headphones on, patiently turning a dial, sifting through the static of the ionosphere for faint, distant signals. For him, the airwaves were a vast, unseen ocean, and he was a fisherman, casting his line for conversations from half a world away. In the spring of 1998, during the strange, twilight weeks when the Alaskan winter reluctantly gives way to a muddy, protracted thaw, Harold began picking up something new. It was a Morse code signal, weak but clear, riding a low-frequency band usually reserved for weather beacons. The code was slow, deliberate, and perfectly formed. Not the frantic chatter of a distress call, but something more measured, more patient. At first, he dismissed it as atmospheric skip, a stray signal bouncing off the upper atmosphere from some remote naval vessel or military outpost. But it was persistent. Every night, just after the sun finally set, the signal would fade in, a faint, rhythmic pulse in the static. After a few nights of listening, Harold began to transcribe the letters. What he copied down made the hair on his arms stand up. The signal wasn't random call signs or weather data. It was spelling out names, local names, Jensen, Hart, Caldwell. He recognized them immediately. They were all names of local hunters and trappers, men who had gone into the vast Kenai wilderness over the years and had never come back, men whose faces had been on posters in the post office, whose stories were told as cautionary tales in local bars. Jensen had vanished in the Kenai Mountains in '82. Hart's empty truck was found near Tostamena Lake in '91. Caldwell's plane had gone down somewhere over the Harding ice field a decade ago. The list went on, a ghostly roll call of the lost. Harold was a rational man, a technician at heart. He spent the next week cross-referencing the names he copied with public records of missing persons cases in the Kenai Peninsula Borough. Every single name transmitted by the phantom signal belonged to someone who had been officially declared lost, presumed dead. His hands shook as he worked. This wasn't a prank. The sheer accuracy and the obscurity of some of the names made that impossible. He had to find the source. Using a directional antenna and triangulation software he had designed himself, he began to hunt for the signal's origin. The process was slow, painstaking. The signal was weak and prone to fading. But after 3 nights of meticulous work, his system returned a result. The coordinates it provided were shocking. The signal was originating from a location 15 miles southwest of his home, from the middle of the Chickaloon Flats. The Chickaloon Flats are a vast, treacherous expanse of tidal marshland, a maze of shifting mud and deep, water-filled channels. It's a place that is all but inaccessible, especially at night when the tide comes in. There were no known structures, no cabins, no beacons in that area. Nothing. The next day, Harold contacted the local chapter of the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL, and shared his findings. He was met with a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. Another ham operator with similar equipment confirmed Harold's triangulation. The signal was undeniably coming from the empty tidal flats. A group of them, including a bush pilot, decided to investigate. They flew over the coordinates in a small Cessna. What they saw below was exactly what they expected: an endless, uniform expanse of brown mud and gray water, devoid of any sign of human activity. There was no antenna, no building, no sign of a power source, nothing that could possibly house a radio transmitter. Yet, that night, the signal returned, right on schedule. Faint but clear. It spelled out a new name: Archivist, P-A-R-K-S. A quick search revealed that a hiker named Sarah Parks had gone missing near the Russian River just 2 weeks prior. The signal had added a new name to its spectral ledger. The transmissions continued throughout the spring. Every few nights, a new name would be added to the list. Always someone recently lost to the unforgiving wilderness. It became a grim ritual for Harold and the small group of operators who were listening. They were transcribing an obituary written in static, broadcast from a place where no one could be. As the spring breakup season reached its peak and the days grew longer, the signal began to weaken. By the time the summer solstice arrived, bringing with it the perpetual daylight of the Alaskan midnight sun, the signal had vanished completely. The airwaves from the Chickaloon Flats fell silent. The ARRL Alaska Chapter Bulletin published a short, discreet article about the Soldotna signal, describing it as an unresolved mystery. The official explanation, favored by engineers, was a complex case of ionospheric reflection, perhaps a repeating signal from a military submarine bouncing off a specific atmospheric layer, its message distorted into what sounded like names. But Harold Vance doesn't believe that. He knows the precision of the code he copied, the chilling accuracy of the names. He believes that for a few weeks in the spring of 1998, as the ice and snow melted and the land gave up its secrets, something out there on those desolate flats was acting as an antenna. Something was broadcasting a message, a quiet, methodical accounting of the souls the Kenai had claimed. He still monitors that frequency every spring, but the signal has never returned. The silence that remains is, in its own way, more terrifying than the ghostly transmissions it replaced. It's the silence of a ledger that is closed, for now. The container ship ledger. The port of Anchorage is a place of relentless, structured chaos. For Simon Finch, a dock clerk working the night shift in September of 2009, his world was a grid of numbers, a meticulous ballet of manifests, crane logs, and container identification codes. His job was to ensure that the physical reality of the cargo matched the digital reality on his screen. A discrepancy was not just an error. It was a tear in the fabric of his orderly world. The night was cold and wet, a typical Anchorage autumn evening. Simon was reconciling the cargo unload from the MV Northern Light, a massive container ship that had just arrived from Seattle. The process was routine. He would check off each container number on his manifest as the crane operator's log confirmed the lift from the ship to the dock. Crane lift, container ID, check. Lift, ID, check. It was a rhythm, a mantra of logistics. He was near the end of the manifest, the final 20 containers. The crane log showed lift number 437. The container was a standard 40-foot refrigerated unit, ID number MSCU-388172-4. Simon's finger traced down his digital manifest. The number wasn't there. He checked again, his brow furrowing. He scanned the entire list. Nothing. He pulled up the ship's original cargo plan from Seattle. The container wasn't on it. According to the paperwork, container MSCU 388172-4 did not exist on this vessel. Yet the port's own crane, a multi-million-dollar piece of precision machinery, had logged its lift, its sensors recording the weight, the time, and the ID number scanned automatically as it was hoisted from the ship's hold. He radioed the crane operator, a gruff but reliable man named Al. Al, Simon here. Can you confirm lift 437? Container 388172-4. Al's voice crackled back. Yeah, Simon, that's a good lift. Reefer unit. Put her down in Sector G, row 4. Right where the system told me to. Simon's office overlooked the container yard. He grabbed a pair of binoculars and scanned Sector G, row 4. He counted the containers. There were 5, just as the yard plan indicated. He cross-referenced their ID numbers. All 5 were on his manifest. The extra container, the one Al had just placed, was not there. A cold knot of anxiety began to form in his stomach. A computer glitch? A sensor misread? Those things happened. But the crane log was a primary record. It was the port's version of reality. He pulled up the CCTV footage. The camera covering Sector G was aimed perfectly. He scrubbed the video back to the timestamp of lift 437. He watched as the crane's massive spreader descended into the ship's hold, out of the camera's view. He watched it rise back up, carrying a container. He saw the container swing over the dock, a large white refrigerated unit. He watched it descend towards Sector G, row 4, and then, for exactly 12 seconds, the video feed dissolved into a blur of gray static. When the picture returned, the crane was already retracting, empty, and the row of containers in Sector G looked exactly as it had before. There was no new container. The 12 seconds in which the container should have been placed on the ground were simply gone. A blank spot in the digital memory of the port. Simon felt a wave of vertigo. He had a crane log confirming a lift. He had a crane operator confirming the placement. He had CCTV footage that showed the container in the air, but not on the ground, with a convenient and inexplicable gap in the recording. He ran a system-wide search for the container ID. The result came back. No record found. It was a ghost in the machine. A piece of cargo that had existed for the 6-minute duration of its journey from ship to shore, only to dematerialize into thin air. He spent the rest of his shift trying to find a rational explanation. He checked for duplicate lift entries, for manual input errors, for server synchronization faults. He found nothing. The system was clean. The discrepancy was a single, stubborn, impossible fact. The next morning, he filed a cargo discrepancy report detailing the phantom container. He was called into his supervisor's office. The supervisor, a man who saw the world only through the lens of profit and loss, was not amused. He showed Simon the final reconciled numbers, everything balanced. The ship's manifest matched the port's inventory. There was no missing container, because there was no record of it ever existing in the first place, aside from Simon's report and a single anomalous line in a crane log which had since been flagged as a sensor error. Simon insisted. He mentioned the CCTV footage. The supervisor pulled it up. The 12-second gap of static was there. "That's a camera dropout, Finch," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Happens all the time. Bad weather. Signal interference. You've been working too many night shifts." Simon was given a formal reprimand for filing a falsified report, a black mark on his otherwise perfect record. He was told to drop it. He tried. He went back to his job, to the endless grid of numbers and IDs, but he couldn't shake the memory of that night, the certainty of the crane operator's voice, the image of the white container hanging in the air on the video feed, the perfect surgical removal of the moment of its arrival. He became obsessed. In his spare time, he started digging into old port records, looking for similar sensor errors. He found a handful over the years, all dismissed as technical glitches. A container that was logged as being loaded onto a ship but never arrived at its destination. A fuel tanker that recorded discharging 10,000 more gallons of fuel than its tanks could hold. Each one was a small, inexplicable tear in the fabric of logistics, neatly patched over with a plausible, technical explanation. The official record of the Port of Anchorage for that night is clean, but Simon Finch knows that for a few minutes another container sat on their docks. He doesn't know what was in it, where it came from, or where it went. He only knows that the complex, logical system he dedicated his life to is built on a foundation that is not as solid as it seems, and that sometimes things arrive at the port that are not meant to be recorded. Things that are unloaded by ghost cranes and stored in yards that exist only in a 12-second gap of static. The tundra siren. In the summer of 1980, the North Slope of Alaska was a frontier of oil and ambition, a place where modern technology was pitted against one of the harshest environments on Earth. Ben Carter was a survey pilot, a job that consisted of flying low and slow over the endless, featureless tundra, his eyes tracing the faint lines of geological formations. It was a job of immense solitude, his small plane a tiny, buzzing speck in a sky that was too big, over a land that was too empty. During a routine survey flight in August, hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, his aircraft's radio began to emit a strange tone. It wasn't the usual crackle of atmospheric interference. It was a clear, rhythmic pulse, a structured signal cutting through the static. Ben was a former Navy pilot. He recognized it instantly. It was Morse code. An emergency tone, specifically. A repeated, urgent signal that translated to SOS. His training kicked in. He banked the plane, following the signal's growing strength. His instruments indicated the source was directly below him. He looked down from his cockpit window. All he could see was a flat, monotonous expanse of green and brown permafrost, dotted with shallow, shimmering lakes. There was no wreckage, no sign of a camp, nothing. Yet the signal was strong, insistent, a desperate electronic scream from the empty wilderness. He circled the area, his GPS locking onto the coordinates of the signal's origin. He radioed in the distress call to the FAA station at Prudhoe Bay, relaying the coordinates and the nature of the signal. A search and rescue operation was immediately launched. A helicopter was dispatched, and Ben stayed on station, circling high above, a lonely sentinel. When the helicopter arrived, an hour later, its crew reported the same thing he was seeing. Nothing. The pilot, however, confirmed he was also receiving the faint Morse code signal on his radio. The helicopter landed, its rotors kicking up a spray of water and loose vegetation. The ground search team, clad in heavy gear, began a methodical sweep of the area defined by the signal's peak strength. They walked in a grid pattern, their boots sinking into the soft, spongy tundra. After an hour of searching, they found it. It wasn't a downed plane or a stranded hiker. It was an old radio mast, perhaps 30 feet tall, lying on its side, half swallowed by the permafrost. It was rusted, bent, and clearly ancient, the relic of some long-forgotten survey camp or military outpost from the Cold War era. At the base of the mast, sunk deep into the moss and mud, was a metal box containing the radio equipment. The box was corroded, its seals broken. The inside was a mess of decayed wiring and water damage. The power source consisted of a bank of old, heavy-duty batteries. They were swollen, cracked, their terminals coated in a thick, white crust of corrosion. They were, by any reasonable definition, completely and utterly dead. Yet, when one of the technicians put a voltmeter to the terminals, he got a faint, almost imperceptible reading. And from the radio speaker, so faint it was barely audible over the wind, came the rhythmic pulse of the Morse code. The mast, despite being disconnected and collapsed, was somehow still acting as an antenna. The dead batteries were still producing just enough of a phantom charge to power the transmitter's most basic function. It was a ghost in the machine, a piece of technology that had refused to die, broadcasting its lonely, decades-old distress call into the void. The team dismantled the unit, silencing the signal for good. The final FAA pilot incident note was brief and clinical. It recorded the discovery of a derelict radio beacon, attributing its mysterious activation to a rare chemical reaction within the frozen, decaying batteries. It was a plausible, scientific explanation, a neat closing of the file. But Ben Carter, who had first heard that desperate call from the empty tundra, was left with a chilling set of questions that the report didn't answer. Whose distress call was it? Who had set up that lonely outpost? And what had happened to them? The signal was an SOS, a call for help from a place where no help could ever have reached them. For Ben, the incident was a stark reminder of the nature of the landscape he flew over every day. The tundra was a place that held on to things, that preserved them in its frozen grip. It held the bodies of mammoths, the secrets of ancient ice, and sometimes it held on to a voice that had been crying for help for decades, long after there was anyone left to save. Its call finally answered by a world that had forgotten it ever existed. The silence where the signal used to be was now, for Ben, a far more haunting presence on his flights over the North Slope. The hydrology camp doctor Elena Rostova was a creature of data and precision. As a field hydrologist for the United States Geological Survey, her job was to measure the lifeblood of the Alaskan wilderness, its rivers. In May of 2017, her small team had established a temporary research camp on a gravel bar near the Copper River, a massive braided waterway fed by dozens of glaciers. Their world was one of solar-powered sensors, streamflow gauges, and the relentless, soothing roar of the water. The work was methodical. Every day, they would wade into the frigid, silt-laden channels to check their equipment. The primary instruments were a series of heavy steel measuring rods driven deep into the riverbed, equipped with pressure transducers that recorded water depth and velocity in real time. This data was transmitted back to their laptop in the main tent, painting a continuous digital picture of the river's behavior. For the first week, the data was predictable. The river rose slightly during the warmth of the afternoon as glacial melt increased, and fell again during the cold of the night. It was a steady, reliable rhythm, the heartbeat of the river. On the morning of the 8th day, Elena woke to a strange silence. The river's roar seemed diminished. She unzipped her tent and stepped out into the pale light of dawn. The air was still, the sky a clear, brilliant blue. But something was wrong. Her lead technician, a young man named Sam, was standing by the riverbank, staring at the water with an expression of disbelief. Elena walked over to him. "What is it?" she asked. He pointed, his hand trembling slightly, across the wide braided plain of the river. Every single one of their measuring rods was gone. Not just knocked over, but completely vanished. These were 10-foot lengths of reinforced steel, anchored in concrete footings 3 feet below the riverbed. It would take a catastrophic, debris-filled flood to dislodge them. But the river was calm, lower than it had been the day before. The gravel bar they were camped on was dry and undisturbed. There had been no storm, no flood. Elena rushed back to the data tent and opened the laptop. The data from the previous night was unlike anything she had ever seen. At exactly 3:04 a.m., the sensors had registered a sudden, astronomical surge in water volume. For a period of 22 minutes, the river's flow had increased by a factor of 10. A wall of water that, according to the data, should have been 30 feet high. A deluge that would have obliterated their camp and scoured the entire valley. The pressure readings on the transducers spiked to impossible levels, registering forces that would snap steel like a twig. And then, at 3:26 a.m., every single sensor went offline simultaneously. After that, nothing. Just a flat line. Elena stared at the graph, her scientific mind rebelling against the information. A surge of that magnitude would have left a clear trail of destruction. Uprooted trees, fresh erosion, debris lines high on the valley walls. But there was nothing. The landscape outside was pristine, untouched. The team's tents, set up only 50 yards from the main channel, were not even damp. It was as if a ghost flood had passed through, a flood that existed only in the memory of their instruments. They spent the rest of the day in a state of confused anxiety. They packed up their camp, a sense of profound unease settling over them. They were scientists, and the data was their gospel. But the data was telling them a story that the physical world violently contradicted. Before they left, the supply helicopter did a low-level aerial survey of the river valley for 5 miles in each direction. The pilot's report only deepened the mystery. There was no sign of a flood. No ice dam had broken upstream. No landslide had temporarily blocked the channel. The river flowed peacefully, its course unchanged. The official USGS Streamflow Bulletin for that period noted the loss of the sensor array due to a suspected, unverified surge event, likely caused by a rapidly forming and disintegrating ice dam in an unmonitored tributary. It was the only possible logical explanation, a way to reconcile the data with the lack of physical evidence. But Elena Rostova knows what she saw, or rather, what she didn't see. She has a printout of that graph from the laptop. The impossible spike that represents a river that swelled to apocalyptic proportions for 22 minutes without disturbing a single stone in her camp. She remembers the feeling of that morning, the unnatural quiet, the sense that the river was holding its breath. Science had given her a plausible explanation, but her gut told her something different. She felt as if they had been camped on the shore of a sleeping entity, and for a few minutes in the dead of night, it had dreamed it was a flood. Their instruments had recorded the dream, and the violence of that dream was enough to break the strongest steel they had. She never returned to the Copper River. She could no longer trust its heartbeat. The fuel dump. In the perpetual wind-scoured twilight of a cold bay winter, reality can feel thin and brittle. For Mark Theron, a civilian contractor stationed at the remote airstrip in March of 1992, life was a series of routines designed to keep the cold and the monotony at bay. His job was simple: manage and maintain the vast fuel dump that serviced the flights connecting this isolated Aleutian outpost to the rest of the world. The dump was a small city of 55-gallon drums stacked in precise geometric blocks inside a chain-link fence, each one accounted for in his meticulously kept logbook. One Tuesday morning, during his daily inventory check, Mark noticed something was wrong. A stack of barrels in the far corner of the compound, a pyramid of 10 drums of de-icing fluid he had personally signed for the previous week, was gone. Not disturbed, not fallen over. Simply vanished. The snow on the ground around the area was pristine, undisturbed by tire tracks or footprints. The massive gate to the compound was still locked, the chain held fast by the heavy-duty padlock he had closed himself the night before. He radioed his supervisor, a man named Henderson, and reported the missing drums. Henderson, accustomed to the strange effects of isolation and boredom on personnel, was skeptical. He told Mark to recount. Mark recounted. 10 drums were missing. 2 other members of the ground crew, who had helped him stack the barrels, confirmed his memory. There had been a pyramid of 10. Now there was just a flat, empty patch of snow. Henderson came down to the dump himself. He looked at Mark's logbook. It showed the full inventory. He looked at the empty space. He walked the perimeter of the fence. There were no breaches. He sighed, a plume of white vapor in the frigid air. "It's a counting error, Mark," he said, his tone final. "They were never there. You stacked them somewhere else and forgot." Mark insisted. He knew he wasn't crazy. He had a distinct memory of the clank of the metal drums, the specific way the light reflected off the frost on their lids. As a last resort, he remembered something. The previous day, an FAA photographer had been on site, taking pictures for a facility update report. Mark found the photographer in the small base cantina. The man, a quiet professional, remembered taking a wide shot of the fuel dump. He agreed to develop the film immediately. An hour later, in a makeshift darkroom, the 4 of them, Mark, Henderson, and the 2 crewmen, huddled over the wet photograph as it emerged in the developing tray. The image was clear. It showed the fuel dump, the neat rows of barrels, the chain-link fence, and in the far corner, exactly where Mark said it should be, was the empty patch of snow. The pyramid of 10 drums was not in the picture. Henderson clapped Mark on the shoulder with a look of pity. "See? Simple mistake. Memory plays tricks on you out here." Defeated and confused, Mark went back to his duties, a gnawing sense of self-doubt eating at him. He adjusted his inventory log, his pen scratching out the 10 drums, officially erasing them from existence. The next day, the supply flight from Anchorage arrived. It brought mail, fresh food, and a new shipment of supplies, including 10 drums of de-icing fluid. Mark and his crew unloaded them, and, with a sense of grim irony, stacked them in the exact same spot where the others had vanished, creating the pyramid anew. The rest of the day was uneventful. That afternoon, the FAA photographer stopped by Mark's office. "Hey," he said, looking embarrassed. "Funny thing happened. I was looking at my contact sheets, and I found another shot I took of the fuel dump from a slightly different angle. I must have taken 2 and forgotten." He handed Mark a freshly developed print. Mark's blood ran cold. The photograph was almost identical to the first one. The same light, the same angle, but in this version, in the far corner, stood the pyramid of 10 drums, exactly as he remembered it. The photographer shrugged. Must have been an issue with the first development. A chemical mix-up or something. Weird, huh? Henderson, when shown the second photograph, was dismissive. He pointed out that the new shipment had already arrived and been stacked. The photo, he argued, must have been taken after that, not the day before. He refused to discuss it further, closing the matter with a terse, "The inventory is correct now." But Mark knew. The light in the second photo, the length of the shadows, was from the morning before, not the afternoon. He was holding two photographs, taken moments apart, that showed two different versions of reality. One in which the barrels existed, and one in which they did not. The official FAA supply audit for that month shows no discrepancies. The logbooks balance perfectly. But in a dusty shoebox in Mark Theron's home in Oregon, there are two photographs. They sit side by side, a testament to a single morning in Cold Bay. He doesn't know what happened to the original 10 drums or why they chose to return in the form of a new delivery. He only knows that for about 24 hours, a piece of the world, a solid, tangible stack of steel and chemicals, had simply decided to not be there. And the universe, in its strange bureaucratic way, had conspired to erase the memory of its existence, leaving only a single, contradictory photograph as proof that his own mind was not the one that was malfunctioning. The Lituya Bay Watch. Lituya Bay is a place of savage beauty and violent history, a dramatic fjord on the outer coast of Alaska, known for generating the largest tsunami waves ever recorded. It is a place that commands respect, a place that feels ancient and alive. For a park ranger, being posted on the solitary watchtower at the mouth of the bay was a coveted assignment, a chance to be immersed in true wilderness. In June of 2001, a young ranger named Sarah Jenkins was on her second week of duty in the tower. Her job was to monitor vessel traffic, observe wildlife, and maintain a constant vigil over a landscape that was both breathtaking and deeply intimidating. The nights were the hardest. The profound silence, broken only by the cry of a distant seabird or the groan of a nearby glacier, could work on the mind. The darkness was absolute, a thick, velvet blackness that seemed to press against the glass of the watchtower. On her fifth night, as she was scanning the bay with night vision binoculars, she saw them. Lights, a series of small, flickering lights, like lanterns or headlamps, moving in a steady procession across the face of the sheer cliffs on the northern side of the bay. Sarah lowered the binoculars, her heart beginning to pound. Those cliffs were a 2,000-foot wall of sheer granite, a technical climb that would be suicidal for even the most experienced mountaineers, let alone in the dead of night. There were no trails, no ledges wide enough for a person to walk on. Yet she could see the lights clearly, moving horizontally across the rock face, about halfway up. There were maybe a dozen of them, keeping a steady pace, their light reflecting faintly on the dark water below. She immediately got on the radio to her supervisor at the main station in Gustavus. She reported what she was seeing, her voice calm and professional despite the tremor she felt inside. Her supervisor was puzzled. He confirmed there were no registered climbing parties in the park. There were no boats in the bay other than a single fishing vessel anchored miles away. He suggested it might be a reflection, perhaps from that boat, or even an atmospheric mirage of lights from a town on the other side of the mountains. A mirage seemed plausible. Lituya Bay was known for strange atmospheric effects. Sarah accepted the explanation, but she kept watching. The lights continued their slow, impossible journey across the cliff face for nearly an hour before they reached the edge of the rock wall and, one by one, winked out as they moved into a deep, shadowed ravine. She noted the event in the official ranger observation log, describing the time, location, and her supervisor's theory of an atmospheric mirage. She tried to put it out of her mind. The next day, as per protocol for any unusual sighting, a helicopter was dispatched to do a flyby of the cliffs. The pilot and an observer scoured the rock face. They found nothing. No ropes, no pitons, no chalk marks, no sign that any human had ever been on that sheer wall of granite. The incident was officially closed. That evening, back in the tower, Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. The watchtower had been in operation for decades. On a dusty shelf in the corner was a collection of old, leather-bound logbooks, the handwritten records of the rangers who had sat in this same chair, watching this same view, long before she had. She pulled out the volume for 1991. She flipped through the pages, filled with notes on bear sightings and the weather patterns. Then she found it. An entry from a Ranger Peterson, dated July 12th, 1991. It described a series of faint, inexplicable lights moving across the northside cliffs, and concluded with the note, "Supervisor suggests atmospheric conditions." Her blood ran cold. She pulled out another logbook, this one from 1978. There it was again, an entry from a Ranger Albright describing phantom lanterns on the cliff face. He too had been told it was a mirage. She spent the rest of the night going through every logbook. She found 17 separate entries, spanning from 1964 to the present day, all from different rangers, all describing the same phenomenon. The slow, silent procession of lights on the impossible cliffs of Lituya Bay. Each report was treated as an isolated incident, each one explained away by the same rational, scientific theory of light refraction. But placed together, they formed a chilling pattern, a secret history of the bay that was hidden in plain sight. These weren't mirages. This was a recurring event, a procession that had been marching across those cliffs for at least half a century. The official NPS record for her sighting in June 2001 is a single, unremarkable line item in the digital database, categorized under atmospheric phenomena. It doesn't connect her sighting to Ranger Peterson's or Ranger Albright's or any of the others. The system wasn't designed to see patterns in folklore, only in data. But Sarah Jenkins knows what she saw. She knows she is part of a long, unspoken tradition of witnesses. She doesn't know who or what the lights belong to, or what grim purpose drives their silent, impossible march across the face of the cliff. She only knows that Lituya Bay keeps a watch of its own, and in the deep of the Alaskan night, when the darkness is total and the silence is absolute, the ghosts of the bay still make their rounds, their phantom lanterns a solemn, terrifying reminder that not all paths are meant for the living. The abandoned snowmobile. In the vast, snow-choked forests surrounding Talkeetna, winter is not a season, it's a state of being. For the volunteers of the local search and rescue team, it's also a busy time. In February of 2014, a call came in about an overdue snowmobiler, a tourist from the lower 48 named Kevin Miller. He had rented a machine that morning for a simple 4-hour ride on a well-marked trail system. He was now 6 hours late, and a heavy snow had begun to fall, erasing tracks and blurring the line between trail and treacherous wilderness. A team of 4 volunteers, including a veteran tracker named Dave Cantwell, suited up and headed out. The rental company had provided the GPS coordinates from the snowmobile's last check-in, a point about 10 miles deep into the trail system. The conditions were deteriorating rapidly, the snow coming down in thick, wet flakes that muffled sound and reduced visibility to a few dozen feet. It was like moving through a white, silent dream. After an hour of hard riding, they found the machine. It wasn't crashed or broken down. It was sitting in a small, perfect clearing, tucked neatly between two large spruce trees, almost as if it had been deliberately parked there, and its engine was still running. The low, steady thrum of the idle was the only sound in the falling snow, a bizarre note of mechanical life in the immense, quiet forest. Dave dismounted, his senses on high alert. The scene was wrong. The snowmobile was undamaged. The key was in the ignition. A half-empty thermos of coffee sat in the handlebar cradle. It looked as if the rider had just stepped off for a moment. But there were no footprints. None at all. The fresh snow around the machine was a pristine, unbroken blanket. Dave walked a slow circle around the clearing, his powerful flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. That's when he found the tracks. Not footprints, but the tracks of the snowmobile itself. They led into the clearing, but not out of it. He followed them back. The trail told a strange, disturbing story. About a quarter-mile back, the snowmobile had left the marked path and driven into the deep woods. The tracks then began to form a wide, perfect circle, about 100 yards in diameter. Dave followed the loop. The machine had driven around this exact same circle not once, but 4 times, the tracks cutting a deep, hypnotic groove in the snow. Then, on the 4th loop, the tracks simply straightened out and drove directly into the small clearing where the machine now sat idling. And there, in the middle of the trail leading into the clearing, the snowmobile tracks just stopped. One moment they were there, deep and clear in the 20 inches of accumulated snow. The next, there was nothing. Just a 10-foot gap of smooth, undisturbed powder. And then the parked idling machine. It was a physical impossibility. A 200-kilogram machine does not simply levitate for the last 10 feet of its journey. The team spread out, conducting a grid search of the area. They used thermal imagers. They shouted Miller's name until their throats were raw. They found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of a struggle. No indication that a human being had been anywhere near this clearing. The only human sign was the snowmobile, which finally sputtered and died as its fuel tank ran dry, plunging the clearing into an even deeper silence. The official SAR mission log documents the discovery of the abandoned machine. The final report, written by the state troopers, speculated that the rider, Kevin Miller, had likely become disoriented in the heavy snowfall. They theorized he had driven in circles, a common behavior for those lost in the wilderness, before abandoning his vehicle for unknown reasons. They suggested he had likely wandered off on foot, and his tracks were quickly covered by the rapidly accumulating snow. He was presumed to have succumbed to exposure. His body was never found. But Dave Cantwell and the other members of the search team know what they saw. They know that the covered tracks theory doesn't explain the 10-foot gap. It doesn't explain the pristine snow around the machine. They talk about it sometimes, in quiet voices, when the snow is falling hard outside. They talk about the strange, methodical circles, as if the rider wasn't lost, but was performing some kind of ritual. They talk about the chilling neatness of the parked machine and the impossible end of the tracks. The official report closes the case with a logical, tragic explanation. But for the men who were there, the story remains wide open. They are left with the deeply unsettling image of a man driving in a perfect circle in the heart of a blizzard. A man who, for the last few moments of his known existence, simply stopped making an impression on the world, leaving behind only a running engine as a testament to his silent, inexplicable departure from the face of the earth. The marine recorder, the waters off the coast of Seward, Alaska, are a symphony of sound. The clicks of whales, the groan of shifting ice, the thrum of fishing boat engines. It's a complex acoustic environment that Dr. Catherine Riley had spent her career trying to decipher. In August of 2006, as part of an NOAA-funded project, her team deployed a series of highly sensitive, deep ocean acoustic data loggers in a remote, protected bay. The bay was officially closed to all motorized vessel traffic, making it the perfect natural laboratory to study the communication of migrating humpback whales. The loggers were designed to run for 3 months, their hydrophones recording every sound, their internal clocks meticulously timestamping each event. When the team retrieved the first logger, Catherine was excited to analyze the data. She expected to find a rich tapestry of marine life sounds. What she found was an anomaly that she could not explain. For the first 2 weeks, the recordings were exactly as expected. The haunting, beautiful songs of the humpbacks, the chatter of seals, the rhythmic pulse of the ocean itself. Then, on the 15th day, a new sound appeared. It was the distinct, low-frequency thrum of a large ship's propeller. The sound was clear, powerful, and utterly out of place in the protected bay. Catherine checked the ship traffic logs for that date. As expected, no vessels were registered as being anywhere near the bay. She assumed it was a rogue vessel, a boat that had entered the restricted area illegally. But the sound wasn't a one-time event. It appeared on the recordings the next day, at the exact same time, 2:41 a.m., and the day after that, and the day after that. Every single night, for the entire remaining duration of the recording period, the sound of a large ship's propeller would fade in, persist for exactly 38 minutes, and then fade out. It was as punctual as a train. Intrigued and slightly unnerved, Catherine began a detailed sonographic analysis of the sound. This is where the mystery deepened into something truly bizarre. When she compared the waveform of the propeller sound from one night to the next, she found that they were not just similar, they were identical. Not just the same frequency and rhythm, but a perfect, bit-for-bit electronic match. Every subtle variation in the engine's rumble, every faint cavitation bubble popped from the propeller, every nuance of the sound was replicated with impossible precision, night after night. It wasn't a recording of a recurring event. It was the same recording, playing over and over again from an unknown source within the bay. It was as if someone had placed a massive, underwater speaker on the seafloor and was broadcasting the same 38-minute audio file every night. The team's next step was to find the source. They returned to the bay with a directional hydrophone array. They waited. At 2:41 a.m., right on schedule, the phantom propeller sound began. A low, stomach-vibrating thrum that seemed to come from all around them. Their equipment, however, was able to triangulate a source. The coordinates pointed to a specific spot in the deepest part of the bay, an area of featureless, muddy seabed over 1,000 feet down. An ROV was deployed. The video feed showed nothing but the murky, desolate landscape of the deep ocean floor. There was no wreckage, no speaker, no sign of any man-made object whatsoever. Yet the sound was undeniably originating from that very spot. The official report on the phenomenon was inconclusive. The leading theory was a highly unusual form of submarine geological activity, perhaps a recurring low-frequency seismic event, or the sound of gas escaping from a seabed fissure, which the sensitive hydrophones were misinterpreting as a mechanical sound. The identical nature of the daily recordings was attributed to a cyclical resonance pattern in the bay's unique underwater topography. It was a complex, jargon-filled explanation that satisfied the requirements of a scientific paper, but did nothing to quell the deep sense of unease that Catherine and her team felt. They had captured a ghost. The NOAA Acoustic Archive for August 2006 contains the data files from that logger. The sound is still there, a digital specter that defies easy explanation. Catherine sometimes listens to it, the perfectly repeating rumble of a ship that was never there. She thinks about the bay's history, a place where many ships were lost during the violent 1964 earthquake. She can't help but wonder if the bay itself had somehow recorded a memory of one of those vessels, a traumatic acoustic echo of a ship's last moments, doomed to be replayed every night in the cold, dark water. It's a thought that lies far outside the realm of her science. But in the dead of night, with the impossible sound of that phantom propeller filling her headphones, it feels closer to the truth than any talk of cyclical resonance patterns. The hospital wing Fairbanks Memorial Hospital, like any institution of its age, was a building of layers, a place where the modern, sterile present was built directly on top of a more complicated past. For Maria Sanchez, a night nurse working the graveyard shift in the winter of 1999, the hospital's silence was a living thing, a quiet hum of machinery and sleeping patients. Her domain was the fourth floor, a busy surgical recovery ward, but at the far end of her floor, behind a set of heavy, permanently locked double doors, was the old North Wing. The wing had been closed for over a decade, its rooms stripped, its electricity and plumbing disconnected from the main hospital grid. It was a dead space, a forgotten annex used for storing obsolete equipment. One December night, during the deepest, darkest part of the shift, around 3 a.m., a light on her central nursing station panel began to flash. It was a patient call light. Maria glanced at the room number beside the light. 482. She frowned. There was no room 482 on her ward. Her ward ended at 460. She checked the hospital schematic taped to her desk. Room 482 was in the abandoned North Wing. She assumed it was a system glitch, a phantom signal in the old wiring. She reset the panel. The light went out. 10 minutes later, it came back on. Room 482. A moment later, another light began to flash. Room 485. Then 481. Within a minute, the entire panel for the North Wing was lit up. A frantic, silent cascade of calls for help from rooms that were not only empty, but officially non-existent in the hospital's active directory. Maria's blood ran cold. She called for the hospital's on-duty security guard, a large, unflappable man named George. When he arrived, he looked at the board, his usual placid expression replaced by one of disbelief. Together, they went to the locked doors of the North Wing. George produced a key from his ring, a key he admitted he hadn't used in 5 years. The lock was stiff, but it turned with a loud groan. They pushed the heavy doors open, their flashlight beams cutting into a thick, dusty darkness. The air that flowed out was stale and cold, the air of a place that had been sealed for a very long time. They stepped inside. The corridor was a ghostly skeleton of what it had once been. Empty rooms branched off on either side, their doorways dark and gaping. The only light was from their beams, reflecting off the peeling paint and the grimy linoleum floor. They found room 482. The room was completely bare. There was no bed, no furniture, just dust and shadows. But on the wall, next to the empty space where a bed would have been, the patient call button was physically depressed, locked in the on position. They checked room 485. The same thing. Room 481. The same. They walked the length of the silent, dark wing. In every single room, the call button was pressed. They returned to the nursing station, their faces pale. The board was still lit up, a silent, impossible plea. Maria called the hospital's head of maintenance at his home, waking him up. He was annoyed, but the urgency in her voice convinced him to come in. He arrived an hour later, carrying a set of old, faded blueprints. What he showed them only deepened the mystery into sheer impossibility. He pointed to the electrical schematics for the north wing. "See this line here?" he said, his finger tracing a path. "When we decommissioned this wing in '87, we didn't just flip a breaker. We physically cut the main power conduit. The entire wing is air-gapped from the hospital grid. There is no electricity running to those call buttons. There is no wire connecting them to your station. It is physically impossible for them to send a signal." The three of them stood in the brightly lit, modern nursing station, staring at the flashing lights from the dark, dead wing. The maintenance chief, a man of logic and circuits, had no explanation. He personally went into the wing and, one by one, manually pried each call button back to its off position. As he popped the last one out in the final room, the entire board at Maria's station went dark, all at once. The official facility maintenance report, filed the next day, is a model of detached technical language. It documents a spurious signal event of unknown origin and recommends a full diagnostic of the nursing station's central panel, which ultimately found no faults. There is no mention of the physically impossible nature of the signals. There is no mention of the discovery of the depressed buttons in the locked, empty rooms. But the staff who work the night shift on the 4th floor know the real story. They avoid looking at the double doors at the end of the hall. They tell new nurses, in hushed tones, about the night the ghost wing woke up. They say that the old wing remembers being a hospital, and that sometimes, in the darkest hour of the night, its phantom patients still cry out for a nurse who can no longer help them. The Quonset hut, Adak Island, in the heart of the Aleutian chain, is a place haunted by the ghosts of the Cold War. By 1987, the once bustling Naval Air Station was being decommissioned, a slow, melancholy process of shutting down a place that had been built to watch for an enemy that never came. Army Corps of Engineers specialist Sam Kincaid was part of the team tasked with the final shutdown, a job that involved methodically cutting power and utilities to the hundreds of buildings scattered across the barren, windswept landscape. His work was a litany of checklists and safety protocols, a final, orderly goodbye to a piece of military history. The building in question was a standard Quonset hut, designated Building 714, located on a remote, isolated part of the base near the old antenna fields. According to Sam's work order, the hut's main power line from the substation had been physically severed a week prior. His job was a final sweep, to verify a cold and dark status before signing off on its demolition. He arrived in his truck on a gray, drizzly afternoon. The hut was a picture of dereliction, its corrugated steel skin streaked with rust, its windows boarded up. As he approached, he felt a strange, tingling sensation on his skin, like static electricity. He dismissed it as the damp, charged air common in the Aleutians. He unlocked the padlock and heaved the main door open. The interior was dark and smelled of mildew and ozone. He flicked his flashlight on. The beam revealed a single large room, empty except for some discarded radio equipment and rows of defunct electrical panels. A string of bare industrial light bulbs hung from the curved ceiling. They should have been dark. They were not. The bulbs were glowing. It wasn't a bright, full illumination, but a faint, sickly, orange-white light, a spectral imitation of electricity. The filaments inside the bulbs were clearly visible, burning with a steady, impossible glow. Sam stared, his mind refusing to accept what he was seeing. He knew, with absolute certainty, that there was no power running to this building. He walked over to the main breaker panel on the wall. As he had been briefed, the thick, armored conduit that should have fed power into it was cut, its heavy copper wires splayed and taped off, inches from the connection terminals. There was no physical path for electricity to enter the building. He unholstered his handheld multimeter, a device he trusted more than his own senses. He switched it to detect AC voltage. He held the probes up in the open air, near one of the glowing bulbs. The meter's digital display, which should have read 0, flickered and then settled on a reading of 110 volts. It was detecting a standard electrical field in the air itself. Shaken, he decided to document his findings, as per protocol. He retrieved his camera from the truck. He needed evidence of this impossibility. He stood in the center of the hut and took a photograph, the camera's flash momentarily overwhelming the faint, ghostly light of the bulbs. As the flash faded, a loud crack echoed through the hut. Every single one of the glowing bulbs exploded simultaneously, showering the floor with tiny shards of glass. The hut was plunged into absolute darkness. At the same moment, the main breaker panel on the wall erupted in a shower of brilliant blue sparks, a violent, explosive arc that made Sam cry out and stumble backward. A smell of burnt ozone filled the air. And then, silence, a profound ringing silence. The faint glow was gone. The static charge in the air had vanished. He cautiously approached the breaker panel with his flashlight. The main breaker switch had been fused into a single, molten lump of metal and plastic. It had been subjected to a massive, instantaneous power surge, a surge that had no source. The Army Corps of Engineers decommission file for Building 714 is brief. It notes the discovery of residual electrical charge in obsolete wiring, which caused a minor breaker overload upon inspection. It recommends immediate demolition of the structure due to unstable electrical systems. It was a tidy, bureaucratic explanation for something that defied the laws of physics. The photograph Sam took was never entered into the official record. It was deemed inconclusive due to flash overexposure. But Sam Kincaid has the print. It shows the Quonset hut's interior, brilliantly lit by his flash. But if you look closely at the reflections in a small puddle of water on the floor, you can see them. The faint, orange-white glow of the light bulbs, captured a microsecond before they were destroyed. Sam doesn't know what kind of energy had collected in that forgotten hut on the edge of the world. He speculates about the decades of powerful radio transmissions from the nearby antenna fields, soaking into the very metal of the building, turning it into a giant, unintentional capacitor. But that is just a theory. All he knows for certain is that he stood in a room that was lit by a ghost current, a room that was not connected to anything, and when he tried to capture its secret, it reacted with a violent, impossible burst of power, as if to guard its own. Mystery, the bridge shift. The Copper River Bridge is a modern marvel of engineering, a vital artery of concrete and steel that spans the treacherous, ever-shifting channels of the river. It is also a structure under constant assault from the Alaskan environment. For Brian Walsh, the Department of Transportation's crew chief for the region, the bridge was a living entity, and he was its physician. In January of 2018, during a brutal cold snap, the bridge's advanced sensor network began to report a bizarre and alarming anomaly. The network, a sophisticated system of load cells and strain gauges embedded within the structure, was designed to provide a real-time picture of the stresses on the bridge. At 3:17 a.m., on a Tuesday morning with temperatures hovering at 30 below, an automated alert went off at the regional DOT monitoring station. The sensors on the bridge's main span were reporting a massive, sudden increase in weight load. According to the data streaming in, the weight on the bridge had tripled in a matter of seconds. It was a load equivalent to a convoy of 3 fully loaded semi-trucks, parked end to end in the middle of the span. But the bridge's traffic cameras, even with their grainy night vision view, showed a completely empty roadway. The thick layer of snow and ice on the pavement was undisturbed. There were no vehicles, no animals, nothing. Brian was called at home. He remotely accessed the sensor data, his engineering mind racing to find a logical cause. A sensor malfunction seemed most likely. A single faulty load cell could throw off the entire system's calculations. But as he looked deeper, he saw that it wasn't just one sensor. All 12 of the load cells on the main span were reporting the same, consistent, massive increase in weight. The data was coherent. The bridge, according to every instrument it had, was under immense strain. An immediate physical inspection was required. Despite the late hour and the brutal cold, Brian assembled his crew. They drove out to the bridge, their truck's headlights cutting through the freezing darkness. As they arrived, they saw exactly what the cameras had shown them: an empty, silent bridge, its steel frame groaning softly in the intense cold. There was no sign of any heavy load. The ice on the road surface was a smooth, unbroken sheet. They walked the length of the span, their powerful flashlights playing over the massive support girders and cables. They found nothing. No structural damage, no visible stress fractures, nothing out of the ordinary. While they were on the bridge, Brian was on the phone with the monitoring station. The technician there was watching the live data feed. He reported that the anomalous load was still present, a massive, invisible weight pressing down on the very spot where the crew was standing. The feeling was profoundly unnerving, to be told by their own instruments that they were in the presence of a colossal force that they could not see or feel. Then, at exactly 3:28 a.m., the technician's voice came over the phone, sharp with surprise. "It's gone," he said. "Brian, the load just vanished. All sensors are back to normal baseline." The event had lasted for exactly 11 minutes. The bridge had reported being subjected to an impossible weight, a weight that had appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as mysteriously. The official DOT report on the incident attributed the anomaly to the extreme cold. The prevailing theory was that the intense, rapid freezing had caused the bridge's steel and concrete to contract in an unusual way, putting immense pressure on the embedded sensors and causing them to misread the internal stress as external weight. It was a sound theory, a perfect example of how extreme environmental conditions can create phantom data. The case was closed, but Brian Walsh isn't so sure. He remembers the feeling of standing on that bridge in the dead of night, the air so cold it hurt to breathe, being told that an invisible force equivalent to 3 trucks was pressing down on the steel beneath his feet. He has looked at the data log 100 times. The onset of the load was instantaneous, not the gradual increase one would expect from thermal contraction. And its departure was just as abrupt. For Brian, the sensor data tells a different story. It tells of something that arrived on the bridge at 3:17 a.m., settled on the main span for 11 minutes, and then departed. He doesn't know what it was. He has no name for a thing that has immense weight, but no physical form. He just knows that every time he drives across that bridge now, especially on a cold, dark night. He can't help but feel that he is crossing a space that is sometimes used by travelers who leave no tracks, and whose passage is measured not in tolls, but in the silent, screaming data of overburdened steel. The outpost cameras, the DEW line station at Barter Island, known as Kaktovik, is one of the loneliest places on Earth, a relic of the Cold War. The radar station is now a semi-automated weather and aviation outpost, a handful of technicians huddled against the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the Arctic coast. In December of 2004, a senior weather technician named Elias Vance was on a 2-month rotation, his life governed by the hum of servers and the flickering of monitor screens. His primary responsibility was to maintain the station's remote camera network, a series of high-resolution, night vision cameras positioned around the perimeter to monitor ice buildup and wildlife. One night, a blizzard of historic intensity descended on the station. The wind howled like a tortured animal, and the snow moved not down, but horizontally, a solid white wall that erased the world. Elias was in the main control room, a warm, bright bubble against the storm's fury, when a motion alert chimed on his console. Camera 4, positioned on the station's eastern perimeter, had detected movement. He pulled up the feed. The image was a swirling chaos of gray and white, the camera's night vision struggling against the blinding snow. But through the maelstrom, he could see them. Figures, 2 of them. They were tall and unnaturally thin, moving slowly but with a steady, deliberate purpose against the full force of the hurricane-strength wind. They were walking just at the edge of the camera's range, their forms distorted by the snow, but they were undeniably humanoid. Elias's first thought was that some of the station's personnel had, for some insane reason, gone outside. He grabbed the station-wide intercom. "This is Vance in control. Is anyone outside? I have movement on the east perimeter." The replies came back quickly from the station's other 3 inhabitants, all of them safely ensconced in the living quarters. No one was outside. To even open a door in this storm would be suicide. Heart pounding, Elias zoomed the camera in. The figures were still there, walking slowly, their heads bowed as if against the wind. Their clothing, what he could make of it, was dark and indistinct, not the bright, bulky Arctic gear worn by the station crew. They seemed unaffected by the wind that was shaking the very foundations of the building he was in. They walked the length of the perimeter fence, and then, one after the other, they were swallowed by the whiteout. Elias saved the video clip and sent a priority alert to the regional security office in Fairbanks. The response was what he expected. It was a glitch. The storm was causing frame ghosting or digital artifacts in the camera feed, a common issue in extreme cold and low-light conditions. The figures were an illusion created by the technology itself. The next morning, when the storm had passed, the station chief and Elias went out to inspect the area. The snow was a vast, pristine, sculpted landscape of deep drifts. They walked the entire eastern perimeter. They found no tracks, not a single footprint. The snow was a perfect, unbroken sheet. Case closed. It was a digital ghost. But that night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., the motion alert from camera 4 went off again. Elias pulled up the live feed. The weather was now perfectly clear, the sky filled with the shimmering green curtains of the aurora borealis. And there, walking along the same path as the night before, were the 2 tall, thin figures. This time, the image was crystal clear. They wore no discernible winter gear. They moved with a slow, gliding motion, their feet seeming to not quite touch the snow. As he watched, Mesmerized and terrified, one of them stopped and slowly turned its head to look directly at the camera. He couldn't make out a face, just a dark, smooth oval. It stood there for a full minute, staring into the lens, and then it turned and continued its silent patrol, disappearing into the darkness beyond the station's lights. This time there were no excuses, no storm to blame. Elias saved the footage. He checked the archives, and what he found turned his fear into something far deeper. The archived feed from the previous night, the one from the blizzard, had changed. The sequence he had witnessed was still there, but now it was a perfect loop, repeating itself over and over. He checked the night before that. The same footage was there, in the archive for a night when he knew for a fact he had seen nothing. For 3 consecutive nights, always at 3:17 a.m., the station's own digital memory had recorded the same impossible event, inserting it into the past. The official NOAA report on the incident blames a recurring server error, a data corruption that caused a single video file to be repeatedly copied into the archives. The figures themselves are dismissed as a light anomaly caused by the aurora, but Elias Vance, who resigned his position a month later, knows better. He knows that he was watching a place where the line between a live feed and a recording had blurred. He doesn't know what the figures were or what they were guarding. He only knows that they were not a glitch. They were a part of the landscape, as real as the ice and the wind. And he knows that the station at Barter Island is not just watching the weather. It is itself being watched by sentinels who leave no tracks, whose patrol is so punctual that it can be written into the memory of a machine, a ghost that haunts not the station but the data itself. The ferry lifeboat, the Alaska Marine Highway System, is the lifeline of coastal Alaska, its ferries plowing through rough seas and treacherous passages, a constant, reassuring presence for First Officer Graham Shaw, serving aboard the ferry MV Taku. In January of 1996, the pre-dawn safety inspection was a sacred ritual, a methodical check of every piece of life-saving equipment before the passengers boarded for the long run to Sitka. The morning was bitterly cold, a fine, freezing mist coating every surface of the ship in a slippery layer of ice. As Shaw worked his way down the portside deck, his flashlight beam cutting through the semi-darkness, he came to the station for lifeboat number 3 and stopped dead. The davits, the heavy cranes used to lower the lifeboat to the water, were empty. The boat itself, a 24-foot, fully enclosed vessel capable of holding 60 people, was gone. A wave of adrenaline and disbelief shot through him. He immediately raised the alarm. The ship's captain was summoned, and a frantic search of the vessel began. Had the boat been deployed for a drill and not properly secured? Had it been damaged in the rough seas during the night and torn from its moorings? The ship's log showed no drills. The davits and the securing cables showed no signs of stress or damage. They were in their open, unlocked position, as if the boat had been deliberately and properly launched. But no one had launched it. The ship had been underway all night, its small crew accounted for. A full-scale search and rescue operation was initiated. The Coast Guard was notified, and cutters and helicopters began to scour the waters along the ferry's route from the previous night. An all-hands muster of the ferry's crew confirmed no one was missing. A check of the passenger manifest from the previous leg of the journey showed that every passenger had disembarked safely at the last port. There was no reason for a lifeboat to have been launched. The day was spent in a state of high tension and deepening mystery. The search teams found nothing. No lifeboat, no debris, no sign of anything in the vast gray expanse of the Gulf of Alaska. As evening approached, the search was officially called off. The lifeboat and its phantom occupants given up for lost. The Taku was ordered to proceed to its next port, its crew somber and unsettled, the empty davits on the port side a stark and accusing presence. Shaw was on the bridge as the ferry navigated the narrow, ice-choked channel into the port of Sitka. The sun had set, and a cold, heavy fog was rolling in, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. He was staring out into the gloom when the ship's lookout, a young man with sharp eyes, suddenly cried out, "Captain, port side, there's a vessel approaching." Shaw and the captain rushed to the port side window of the bridge. Through a momentary gap in the fog, they saw it. A small, white, covered boat, moving without lights, keeping a steady pace with the ferry. As it drew closer, Shaw felt a sense of profound, terrifying disbelief. He recognized the shape. He recognized the markings on its side, illuminated faintly by the ferry's own deck lights. It was lifeboat number 3. It was back. It maneuvered with an impossible precision in the churning water, coming to rest directly beneath its own empty davits, rising and falling gently on the swell as if waiting to be brought home. The captain, a man of decisive action, ordered a crew to the deck. They looked down from the railing at the lifeboat. It was empty. Its engine was silent, yet it held its position perfectly against the current, nudging gently against the ferry's hull. With a sense of surreal dread, the crew operated the davits, lowering the cables and hooks. They connected them to the lifeboat, and with the groan of the electric winch, the boat was hoisted from the water and secured back into its proper place. The moment it was locked in, the fog, which had held off just long enough for the recovery, closed in again, thick and absolute. Shaw led the inspection of the boat. The interior was dry, but the oars, stowed neatly in their clips, were damp, as if they had been recently used. A thin, perfect rim of frost, the kind that forms on objects that have been exposed to extreme cold for a long time, coated the boat's outer hull. The fuel tank was full. The emergency supplies were untouched. There was no sign of who had taken it or who had brought it back. The official AMHS officer's deck log for that voyage is a masterpiece of maritime understatement. It notes the discovery of the missing lifeboat in the morning, attributing its loss to heavy sea conditions and potential securing failure. A later entry notes the unexpected recovery of the vessel at sea, with no further explanation. The passenger manifest was re-verified and remained unchanged. No one was ever missing. No one was ever found. But Gramshaw knows that for one day, one of his lifeboats went on a journey of its own. It was taken by an invisible crew for an unknown purpose and returned as silently as it had departed. He never looked at the lifeboats the same way again. They were not just equipment. They were vessels of last resort, and sometimes it seemed they answered a call that no living person had made. The Radar Blip Anchorage Center is the nerve center of Alaskan aviation, a dark, quiet room where air traffic controllers watch over a vast, three-dimensional airspace on their glowing radar screens. For a senior technician like David Chen, whose job it was to maintain and calibrate this multi-million-dollar system, the world was a predictable dance of data packets and transponder codes. In September of 2015, that predictability was shattered. A high-priority medevac flight, a small Learjet carrying a critically ill patient, was on its final approach to Anchorage in the middle of a storm. The weather was bad, a messy mix of snow and freezing rain, the kind of night where pilots and controllers rely completely on their instruments. Chen was monitoring the radar feed from a secondary console, running a routine diagnostic, when he noticed it. A single, Unidentified radar return. A blip. It appeared seemingly from nowhere, materializing about 5 miles behind the medevac jet. It had no transponder code, no flight plan, no identity. It was a primary return, a raw reflection of the radar beam off a solid object. Such ghost returns were not uncommon, especially in heavy precipitation or mountainous terrain. They were usually fleeting, a momentary glitch. But this one was different. It was solid, clear, and it was moving. It fell in perfectly behind the medevac, matching its altitude and speed with uncanny precision. The controller handling the flight, a calm professional named Sarah, noticed it at the same moment. Anchorage Center to medevac 31 Alpha. Do you have traffic at your 6 o'clock, 5 miles? She asked, her voice steady. The pilot's response was immediate. Negative, Center. We're in the soup here. Can't see a thing. Our TCAS is clear. We show no other traffic. TCAS, the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, relies on other aircraft's transponders. If the object had no transponder, the TCAS wouldn't see it. But the radar did. For the next 20 minutes, the unidentified blip maintained its position, shadowing the medevac with a consistency that was both baffling and deeply unsettling. It was a perfect, silent escort. It didn't deviate, it didn't waver, it just followed. David ran every diagnostic he could think of. Was it a radar malfunction? A system echo? He switched to a different radar antenna array. The blip was still there, just as clear. He cross-referenced with military radar. They saw it too, a non-cooperative target of unknown origin, but they had no assets close enough to intercept and identify it. In the control room, the atmosphere grew tense. Sarah guided the medevac pilot through his landing approach, her voice never betraying the fact that he was being followed by something unknown. The pilot, focused on flying his aircraft in near-zero visibility, remained unaware. David and the other controllers watched their screens, mesmerized. The medevac jet descended through the clouds, its own transponder signal showing its steady drop in altitude. The blip followed, matching its descent foot for foot. It was as if the two were connected by an invisible thread. The medevac's landing gear touched down on the runway at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport. Its blip on the radar screen rolled down the runway and turned onto the taxiway. And at the exact, precise second that the medevac's radar signature disappeared as it pulled up to the terminal, the unidentified blip trailing it simply vanished. It didn't fly away. It didn't fade out. It was there one moment and gone the next, as if it had served its purpose and switched itself off. The subsequent investigation was thorough. The FAA radar archive was analyzed frame by frame. The recordings confirmed what everyone in the room had seen. A solid, unidentified object had shadowed a medical flight for 20 minutes and then ceased to exist. The official explanation, after weeks of analysis, was a highly complex and rare form of atmospheric ducting. The theory was that the storm had created a temporary channel in the atmosphere that had somehow captured and reflected the medevac's own radar signal, creating a perfect, delayed ghost image of the plane that appeared to be trailing it. It was a theoretical possibility, a way to explain the impossible with the language of science. But David Chen, who saw the raw data, doesn't buy it. The ghost theory doesn't explain why the blip was a primary return, not a transponder signal reflection. It doesn't explain the military's corroborating track, and it doesn't explain the feeling he had watching it. A feeling not of a technical glitch, but of a deliberate, intelligent action. He keeps a copy of the radar recording on a private drive. He watches it sometimes, the two blips moving in perfect synchrony through the storm. He doesn't know what the object was. A drone? An experimental aircraft? Or something else? He only knows that on a dark and stormy night, a vulnerable flight carrying a person between life and death was given a silent, unseen escort. It was a guardian, a watcher, a phantom that appeared from the storm to see the flight safely to its destination. A radar blip that remains a chilling, unanswered question mark in the otherwise orderly world of the skies above Alaska.